So, Michael, people in the BBC say they're strapped for cash, that this organisation needs this income simply to stay level. Where should the government set it?
Well, first of all, I think we're all strapped for cash, and it's not just the BBC. But the BBC has to live within its means. And, you know, last night I was watching BBC television on iPlayer, and I saw two dramas. One was made by an American company, which was Interview with the Vampires, and the other one was a great one, which I think you'd like, Tom, called The Newsreader, made by ABC Australia, about a newsreader back in the 1980s. Very, very good. But you know what? I was streaming it, and that's the thing, you know, nowadays. Most people are watching television streamed. Now, problem is, the BBC is up against Amazon Prime, it's against Netflix, Disney Plus, Paramount, and all the rest of it. And I just think, you know, the time for the licence fee is rapidly growing to an end. We have to think of a better way.
Michael, am I right in thinking you've worked for the BBC in the past?
Yes, a long time ago, yeah.
Yes, you have. Would it be fair to say that perhaps the BBC doesn't always spend the money it receives from the licence fee as efficiently as it could? I imagine, for example, for a programme like this, they may have a huge number of production staff, a huge number of research and things, and actually they could make cuts quite easily.
Well, I think the BBC, in fairness to the BBC, they've made a lot of cuts already. But you're right. I mean, there's a huge infrastructure. What the BBC is trying to do at the moment is try and centralise some of its activities. So, for example, some of the research done by BBC Newsnight, which hardly gets any viewers nowadays, will now go into a central pool. So it can be used on the BBC websites, BBC local radio, BBC television nationally, BBC radio nationally. Maybe the time for the BBC to concentrate on maybe just 4 television channels and commercialise Radio 1 and Radio 2 is coming along, and I think it's time for the BBC to rethink that maybe the licence fee and the small amount of money it makes from selling television programmes abroad, you know, is coming to an end. They need to make alternative funds from other sources.
Michael, I think that's a really incisive point, because I find it very odd that the government is saying how much money the BBC could have in the first place. It seems like a pretty anti-growth mindset. Ultimately, if the BBC set their own income, they'd be competing probably more with the likes of Netflix and Disney Plus, which cost a lot less. They could sell that product internationally and maybe not be talking about cuts, but instead be talking about growth. Why do the BBC not want to contemplate a world where they're set free from the government and allowed to perhaps grow and expand overseas?
Well, I know all the arguments, and I heard them, you know, years ago. We used to discuss this when I was a member of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, and the BBC would say, well, we'd lose the character of the BBC if we were to be commercial. But you know what? You look at BBC One now, and maybe BBC Two, and certainly BBC Three television. They are trying to go for a maximum audience. They are trying to be commercial. Yes, there are some brilliant television shows on BBC Four and some on BBC Two, which you wouldn't get on a commercial network. But you know what? They have arts television in the US, and people are prepared to pay for it. And I just think, you know, the time, as I said, of a forced licence fee on the BBC is well and truly over. And when it comes to worthwhile services like the BBC World Service, yes, that should be continued to be funded directly by the government. It's in effect our propaganda arm.
Michael, there are so many.
Would never admit that.
Michael, there are so many Conservative MPs who would agree with you. It's why the government has not enacted these changes if there's so much support for doing so. But while we've got you here, can I please ask you about some of the big news today elsewhere? And this is migration. We're expecting a big announcement, a big package of measures to bring that legal migration figure down later today. Things like a big rise in the minimum salary threshold for skilled workers, an overhaul of the shortage occupation list. What could we see here?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see when the Prime Minister makes his statement. But, you know, a lot of these are Robert Jenrick's plans, which had been held back for so long. But with polling now that Rishi Sunak is less popular than Liz Truss was when she was the least popular, if you see what I mean, he knows that he's got to deliver. And actually, I think Rishi Sunak's heart is in the right place, but the time for talk is over, it's time for delivery, and he knows that.
The question is it going to be enough? Too little, too late, perhaps?
There's going to be some there's going to be some emergency legislation, I think, this Thursday. So I'll just say to my colleagues, if you are hoping to get back to your constituencies, forget it, because I think we're going to have some legislation which will do what you've just said. That's addressing, of course, by the way, legal migration. What we also have to address, of course, is illegal migration. We made the rather silly promise, in my opinion, to stop the boats. We'll never stop the boats. I mean, why promise something you can never deliver? There's always going to be the odd person coming across in a rowing boat or whatever, but we can certainly reduce by 3/4 or more the number of boats coming across if we bring in the right legislation. But of course, we're scared to say, you know what, we're going to have to get rid of the Human Rights Act, which the government, by the way, hasn't been a part of since 1947 or 48, when the Court of Human Rights came into being. It's actually only been in operation since Tony Blair brought it in. Maybe it's time to get rid of that. I don't know. But we have got to be imaginative about that, just as we've got to be imaginative, too, about BBC funding.
Well, there we go. Michael Fabricant, thank you so much.